Hi, my name is Kunal, and welcome to the Geeks of the Valley podcast, which connects with some of the brightest minds globally who are leading their respective industries today to discuss the hottest upcoming industry trends and how their work is affecting the global economy. This morning from Singapore, we have the partner of Golden Gate Ventures joining us. Please welcome Michael Lints. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And how are things over there in Singapore, especially in light of COVID?
I would say that Singapore has been faring very well. The number of cases have been extremely low. It's been in the one or two cases a day at most. Most of them are zero within the community. There is a number of imported cases, but I would say overall, can't complain. We've been slowly going back to the office. The shops and the restaurants are open. Yeah, so it feels like life is coming back to normal, except that we still are limited in terms of our travel.
So not bad compared to the rest of the world. It looks like you guys are slowly coming off that circuit breaker.
Yeah, so the situation in both the US and Europe seems pretty dire. Of course, I do hope that my friends in the US and in Europe will see improvement in their situation very soon. But yeah, it looks like it's going to take a few months before things get better.
For sure. And let's jump into the first question here, shall we?
Sure.
Tell me about yourself and your background and kind of where you grew up and how did it lead you to becoming a partner with Golden Gate Ventures?
So I'm Dutch, born and raised. My parents are from the Dutch Caribbean. They moved to the Netherlands from Aruba at a very young age. They were, I think it was early in their early 20s. So I'm born and raised in the Netherlands, in a small town called Dordrecht. I won't ask you to pronounce it because it's very difficult with the g. So I spent most of my life there. I've always been in technology, kind of following my late father's footsteps. He was an engineer at the local energy company in Rotterdam, and I always aspired to be in technology as well. So I decided to initially do a very technical study, which is more on coding and development, and then eventually went to university where I did a mix of information technology and business administration. Then after my graduation, decided I wanted to remain in tech. So my first job was at ING. They had a large insurance company back in the Netherlands, and they were starting to build their first e-commerce company. And mind you, this was back in 1998, so that's a while ago. And that first e-commerce company was very interesting because it felt like an in-house startup. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to build an internal comparison site, which actually helped the end consumer compare different insurance products. And this was my first, I would say, kind of my first steps into the startup world, but then within kind of the safe space of a corporation. And so after about 4 or 5 years, I decided that startup life is something that I wanted to pursue. So ended up building a company with two of my neighborhood friends. So we built the company. Name was Enion, and our initial idea was to outsource all the IT for SMEs. So you can imagine that back in the day, people would still have their server on premise. They would still have their all their computers and their maintenance all on premise. And we told them, what you can do is outsource it to us as a company. It will make things easier for you, better maintenance. You're always up to date, and it's cheaper. So this is a company we started in 2000, and eventually the company grew. And I love the fact that we built our first kind of mini data center ourselves. Literally, kind of put everything together. Bought the hardware and started building. Eventually, after this was about 6, 7 years, the company got acquired by a larger company in the south of the Netherlands. And I thought it was an amazing time for me to explore some other things in life. So I made some small investments. I did a lot of advisory work, and I ended up being asked to be a vice chair for the Economic Development Board in Rotterdam. And this was a board that was run by the Dutch government, the Rotterdam municipality, and a lot of international heads of state. And for me, it was amazing because I was only, I have to check, but I think I was only late 20, and just amazing to work with all these experienced politicians, get a sense of public-private relationships. Did a lot of speaking, so learn to kind of be a better keynote speaker. And yeah, it was an amazing journey. And for me, it was again pivotal in my entire journey because I got a much better view of what was happening internationally as well. So after the Economic Development Board, I did 2 terms of 2 years. Again, it was an amazing experience. I decided it feels like a good time to go back into investing. With my tech background, we kind of went to a corporate job, did some work in politics, and I wanted to go back to my passion. And then for some reason, I didn't end up investing in technology at first. I ended up investing in a lot of different companies across the Netherlands. Um, I've noticed very fast that whenever you make investments, you kind of want to stick to stuff that you know and understand and that you're passionate about. So after making a number of investments in a smaller group, it just didn't really work out for none of us. So we decided to close that down. This is about 4 or 5 years later. Um, I wanted to get a better understanding of the sort of the venture capital industry. So one of my good friends, Steph, said, I did a course at Harvard, and I think it would be interesting for you as well. It's a new network, it's a new energy. So I enrolled in a course that it was a private equity and a venture capital course. And during a few of the lessons, I was like, this is amazing, and I definitely want to do more, way more in venture. So one of my classmates, he actually moved, or he lived in Singapore already, and he said he met a young early fund called Golden Gate Ventures, and he had a good chat with the partners. So he made an introduction. I bought tickets flew to Singapore, met Vinny, met Jeffrey, and I loved the passion about the region and how they were trying to build an ecosystem and how they were investing in young talent. So I decided to help them out initially, and that snowballed and ended into me staying and not leaving Singapore. So I've been here for almost 8 years now.
Wow, Michael, what a background from startups to politics to venture. And when looking at Golden Gate Ventures as a fund, what is the fund's investment philosophy and what are some of its most notable investments in Asia Pacific till date?
So we always wanted to focus on the rising consumer class across Southeast Asia. And you have to imagine that in the early days, it took us a lot of convincing for investors to commit to invest with us in this region. So our first fund, which we raised in 2012, was a relatively small fund. It was $10 million. Mostly friends and family because back in 2011, 2012, there wasn't as much institutional capital looking to enter the region. So this first fund was mainly backed by high net worth individuals and a lot of friends from the ecosystem. In 2015, we saw a big rise in interest in Asia in general. And this was mainly driven, or a lot of it was driven by investments that were made in China. But slowly we were seeing that people were also looking at Southeast Asia and were looking to get access to the region. So in 2015, we raised our second fund, which is a $60 million seed and Series A fund. And then in 2018, after a stellar year in 2017, we raised our third fund, which is $100 million. Across our fund, we actually haven't changed our investment thesis as much. So it actually remained the same. So the initial starting point for the fund, as I mentioned, is the rising consumer class. After that, we said when there is a rising consumer class, what comes next? For instance, you can imagine that if people are trying to, buy goods online, or are looking to do payments online, the next thing that you kind of have to do is what are the additional services that people can provide. At the second point, so what you're seeing is that consumers are buying online, but then the companies behind that also need to automate and upgrade their infrastructure. So whether it's payments or inventory management, um, anything that sort of helps the consumer journey. So we're trying to look for those companies and invest in them. So within our portfolio, you'll see companies that are in the logistics space. You see companies that are providing SME SaaS services for entrepreneurs. But then we've also seen other sectors in industry rise, such as education and healthcare. There's more around media and content, social commerce. So there's a number of larger industries that are now picking up as well.
Michael, as you know better than I do, a lot of these low to mid income countries in Asia Pacific are developing this richness and innovation. And in your opinion, what is the landscape like today? And can you talk more about how the ecosystem in both China and India are playing a role in the overall economic impact of the region?
Yeah, I think if you look at the landscape today, what is interesting is a lot of the ecosystem was driven by commerce-related companies, and even if you look at the biggest players in Southeast Asia at the moment, whether it's Grab or Gojek, Traveloka, Tokopedia, it is still very commerce-driven and a lot of it is consumer-facing. But what we're seeing now, and this is where it becomes really interesting, is that the deeper layer within the ecosystem are companies that are in again in the B2B SaaS space. There are companies that are now looking at fertility management. There's companies that are looking at building light versions of SAP like software for SMEs. So there's this deep layer of other companies that are growing at a very fast pace, and it will soon become these larger companies in the region as well. One of the other things that is interesting, and this for me is a big driver from sort of the Chinese ecosystem, is more the use of deep tech in consumer-driven companies. So if you look, for instance, at healthcare, making recommendations. If you look at education, how can we differently look at taking exams as opposed to the traditional way? So a lot of the sort of AI developed technology, so kind of built in China, it's sort of slowly coming here as well. I think the other thing which is important is we've always looked at China as what are the models that have worked there, and how can they work for Southeast Asia. So just to give an example, if you look at the larger commerce companies and the larger healthcare companies and even the larger education tech companies, a lot of these models have been almost ported over to Southeast Asia. So for us, it kind of China gives us sort of a look in the future, to see what could potentially work and what can't potentially work. I think India itself is a different story altogether. I think the ecosystem in India sort of had their ups and downs. I still remember that in 2015, a lot of capital was looking to deploy into companies in India. But the investors were concerned that a lot of it were paper gains that didn't really sort of turn into actual liquidation events for investors. So investors were of course nervous because they see their money kind of being locked up for 10 years, but there wasn't any clear sight on any larger exits. I think people are now revisiting the India ecosystem, which is again good for us because it also gives attention to us. But I say that the influence of the Chinese tech ecosystem for Southeast Asia is larger than the ecosystem in India.
And Michael, being a veteran investor for the last 10 plus years, as you alluded to earlier, How have you seen being a startup founder evolve over the last decade? And how has your personal investment philosophy evolved with this?
Um, I'm guessing if you look at the start of sort of the ecosystem 10 years ago, and there were some amazing sort of early accelerators, helping companies, and companies like I'll give one name, which is a company like TradeGecko, which is in the SME SaaS space. Um, they've been able to leverage on some of the accelerators that were here early days. What I do notice that now is that there's a lot of support for startups compared to 7, 8 years ago. All the big brands are here: Google, Facebook, AWS, IBM, Microsoft, and they're all having programs that are supportive of startups. And whether it's using credits to set up your servers, whether it's CTO sessions, doing technical architecture deep dives, there's so much available to kind of help founders in their first years. On the capital side, things are definitely changed, where there's more capital available kind of across the ecosystem. I think what still remains interesting as well is that a lot of the entrepreneurs that we backed initially were first-time entrepreneurs, and they, of course, as first-time entrepreneurs, you make first-time mistakes. Um, the biggest, I guess, the biggest thing we learned from that era is that a lot of these early companies need sort of hands-on advice, and whether it's sort of hiring their first senior lead or expanding to a new market, fundraising their next big round. But we're now seeing that a lot of entrepreneurs that are coming to market are people that have worked at big tech companies and decide to go on their own. So they might have spent, the first few years at a Grab or a Gojek or a Traveloka or or Bukala Park, and then decide, hey, I want to venture out on my own and start my own business and start my own startup. And those founders are noticeably more experienced because they've seen firsthand what it takes to build a company. They've built up relationships. They understand what a product roadmap means. So those founders are more experienced, and they're able just to fundraise at a faster clip. I'm noticing that they're very hands-on the fundraising side. They've learned to kind of get the right product people around them. So I think the biggest difference in the evolvement of founders between sort of 7, 8 years ago to now is there's a lot of experience that founders now can lean on, and there's a big supportive ecosystem that founders can depend on when they start their own company. I think when it comes to my personal investment thesis, I'm more focused on are founders able to solve and think of how can you generate significant impact. And I'm not talking about social impact and don't make any revenue. I'm actually talking about, is your company building or supporting an infrastructure that eventually has impact on a large demographic across the region. And this can both be on the B2C and the B2B side. So interesting verticals for that would be things in healthcare, logistics, supply chain management, farming, agriculture. I think those are sort of interesting topics from a personal standpoint, but I'm trying to look at and see, where can we drive local or regional innovations and which founders are driving that.
So, Michael, now I really want to take a turn in the conversation to discuss a few things that you hold closely to you within your personal life around the aspect of systematic racism. And recently, you recorded a documentary with Broken Chains focused around race, inequality, and the economic impact of racism. At a high level, can you speak about some of the points discussed in this documentary that you hold dear to you?
Yeah, the documentary called Broken Chains came together about 9 months ago. Um, so after the events in the U.S. and George Floyd, I felt compelled to write an article about my own experience with racism and sort of how I try to deal with racism and try to um, yeah, I guess sort of try to explain to my kids what it means to have to look differently than some other people. And in that discussion, I was writing down an article about whenever I travel, what I encounter, some of the jokes that people make, or um, not being taken seriously. I almost got arrested in the U.S. Because I literally was trying to get into an Airbnb that we, of course, booked, and the police thought I was breaking into a home. So all of these things added up, and I guess there was a global outcry last year after George Floyd. So I felt compelled to write an article about it. Um, the article was um, went viral. Got a lot of responses to it, and a filmmaker that I know in Singapore approached me after the article and said, "Hey, this story is really strong and it resonates with a lot of people. Um, why don't you kind of make a documentary around it?" Um, I felt that there's a lot of content available on systemic racism and racial injustice. But after sort of having this conversation with the team, they said, no, we want to approach it from a different angle. Because a lot of people tend to say when there is people of color that have been successful in their own right, that there's no it solves the issue of racism. And once you're successful, you don't encounter any racism anymore, which is of course not true. So we decided to kind of take the angle of what does it mean to create uh, generational wealth for people of color, because one of the larger issues when it comes to um, not getting access to education, not getting access to jobs, not getting access to home ownership, it usually goes back to there's hardly any generational wealth. So we decided to look for the world's best experts when it comes to the racial wealth gap. We looked for the experts when it comes to investments in Black and Latinx founders, um, and all of them were very willing to speak for the documentary. So eventually, we are now in the midst of shooting. We're hoping to finalize it in June this year. But what is interesting is that from the journey, I'm learning so much, having these conversations and doing these interviews and doing the research. And it's unbelievable how much work still needs to be done to make sure that there is racial equality, and to make sure that we kind of solve this wealth gap, and to make sure that future generations are able to kind of own a home, are able to have access to every education that anyone else has access to as well, and then hopefully the mindset around race will change over time.
And Michael, how does this transfer into being a minority investor in Asia? Multiple times across different media channels and articles, you have said this phrase, that very, very deep phrase: I am exhausted and I want you to know why.
Yeah, it comes from it's funny that racism can be extremely subtle, and it can be in a few small things. Someone making a joke about your skin color, um, taking longer to get to the line at the airport, or they take you aside to kind of do a few double checks, seeing surprise faces when you walk into a board meeting because they expected someone else. Um, Assume that you're not able to make or drive your own career because of your background. And it's exhausting. And it's exhausting to have um, sort of those conversations sort of over and over again. And it almost feels like you have to sort of excuse yourself for being black. Um, so yeah, I felt extremely tired, but I felt compelled to also share it. And again, there's a lot of it is extremely subtle. But if it happens on a very regular basis, it does get really exhausting.
And for podcast listeners out there, Michael's Medium article will be shared in the podcast notes, so please look below. Michael, to wrap up our call with our last question today, what piece of advice would you give to people out there from the journey you have had so far in life?
Um, yeah, so if word of advice, kind of for anyone, kind of going into business, whether it's building a company, becoming a VC, working at a corporation, or any decision. I think there's two parts that are very important. The first part is to kind of yeah feel you have to kind of almost feel the decision. And I always say kind of feel with your gut and what does your gut tell you. And this could be anything from um, there's a misalignment. You feel there's a misalignment between you and a potential business partner or someone that you're going to be working for. Um, when you don't feel there is full trust, um, when you feel that um, you're not able to kind of manage expectations properly. I would always take those feelings into account because it's important that whenever you commit to something, that you're able to kind of give everything at that point in time. The second part is around sort of really taking a step back and trying to understand what the impact of a decision is. Um, and not saying that you should be risk averse. Actually, the opposite. I've taken some huge risks in my life, um, but it is helpful to kind of take a step back and understand what does this decision mean for me. Is it does it mean I'm going to be working for 24/7 for the next 6 months? Um, am I able to meet expectations? And am I able to voice my concerns in the group that I'm working with? So it's always helpful to kind of take one step back and say, hey, these are the things that I'm buying into if I make this decision. I think that is my biggest life lessons when it comes to sort of making important decisions in your life. Um, and it's also important to um, every now and then, not always, to go with the flow and kind of see where things lead you.
So, really kind of combining both the conscious and subconscious mind to some extent, right? The conscious mind being that you are kind of aware of what's going on around you, right? While the subconscious mind is a representation of your gut in a way.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
And Michael, for people who are interested in reaching out to you or catching a cup of coffee with you, what would be the best point of contact?
The easiest way is just send me the email. Um, that is the best and the faster way to reach me. Um, I try to always I try to always respond, relatively fast. Of course, life sometimes get away from you, so it's not easy possible to kind of always schedule time. But I'm always happy to give some advice or kind of look at a company, sort of give my opinion. Yeah, so feel free to reach out, send me an email, michael@goldengate.vc. Yeah, always happy to see where I can be helpful.
Michael, it was a pleasure having you on Geeks of the Valley, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.